Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Doug Lemov, Colleen Driggs, Erica Woolway, and Christopher Such. Great to have you guys here today. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, for happy to be here. Great to see you both.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Really exciting.
We look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Kieran.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, like I said, as soon as I saw there was an opportunity to talk about the TLAC guide to the science of reading, I thought absolutely have to make that happen. And so I think most people will know you as the team behind Reading Reconsidered, but we're going to talk about the TLAC guide to the science of reading. I think TDaPE listeners, Thinking Deeply About Primary Education listeners, are likely to be familiar with your work in many respects. And I think Reading Reconsidered was a hugely influential book. What inspired you to write again on the subject of reading? And what would you say are the key differences between this book and Reading Reconsidered?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll just start off talking about it, and then Colleen and Erica can amplify themes. We actually set out to write this as Reading Reconsidered 2.0. And in many ways, the book has a lot of things in common with the way that we try to approach teaching problems. You know, we try to share lots of videos of teaching, and we've learned so much from watching people use ideas in Reading Reconsidered. So there are a lot of linkages. But I think we realized a couple of things. One of them is that I think the world has changed since we wrote Reading Reconsidered. And one of the most important ways, I don't think when we wrote Reading Reconsidered, we imagined a world in which we would have to mount a defense for the book in the reading classroom. But technology has changed the way that young people think. Suddenly, attention is a hugely important issue. That, you know, reading is such an attentionally demanding activity that I don't think we can ignore the way that students' attentional habits, because of social media and cell phones, have changed the minds that they bring into the classroom. And that has had a cascading series of effects on how teachers approach, you know, the idea of asking students to read for long and sustained periods of time from books of merit. And so I think there are, you know, several chapters in here that are really about how do we respond as reading teachers to this newer world. I think maybe one of the other really important changes is that since we wrote Reading Reconsidered, we tried to write a curriculum, because I think we recognized that, particularly in reading, pedagogical changes really can't be made without also making lesson plan and unit plan design changes. And so the book, I think, also outlines our experience, led by Colleen, in particular, in trying to write a curriculum and daily lesson plans around reading that will allow teachers to teach more effectively and students to get more out of reading. And so I think those changes in particular, and maybe just there's so much more science, and our awareness of the science has grown so much, that those three things made us feel like we set out to make it a 2.0, but we really couldn't. It really announced itself to us as a different book.
First thing, from my point of view, congratulations on the book. I know you've already started describing it, but it is, so much of it is going to be really valuable for teaching professionals, both in the States and over here. The book starts, or quite close to the start, there are 7 arguments that you make that I think make a compelling case for what I think can be described as a knowledge-rich, book-focused approach to the teaching of reading. And I wonder whether, for listeners, you'd be willing to outline some or maybe all of these arguments.
Sure, Chris. I'll just try and give a quick summary of the 7 arguments. The first chapter is sort of a summary of the 7 arguments. Then there's a chapter on attention and how important harvesting and building attention is in the classroom. We think that if the cell phone has taught us one thing, it is that attention is malleable. And I think we've seen, I feel that in my own reading, how much more challenging it is to sustain my own focus in a long text. This is clearly the case for students. But we think that an intentional reading environment that is high text, low tech can actually be critical to rebuilding students' attentional skills, that we should build attentionally privileged environments in the classroom, but that we can use reading as a tool to help students rebuild that fractured attention. And we think that that's really important because reading relies on it so much. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about fluency, which I know is something you've written about as well, and how, you know, we describe fluency as a precondition, a prerequisite to comprehension. If your working memory is overloaded trying to read the text at the speed of sight, you will not be able to make many insights and comprehend or remember much about the text. And I think this is one of the real surprises for us in writing this book, is to no one really knows how extensive disfluency is among older students, but it is surely massive. Probably in some areas, greater than 50% of students cannot read the text that we put in front of them fluently. Huge issue. Chapters 3 and 4 are about background knowledge, the importance of background knowledge. I think many teachers know about the importance of background knowledge, but what does one teacher do? You know, like, how do you teach differently if we decide that reading is about knowledge-rich environments and not transferable skills? And so we have, there's lots there that I'll let Colleen and Erica amplify. There's a chapter on vocabulary. You know, I think you could describe vocabulary as a subset of knowledge, but it's such a profoundly important subset of knowledge. Almost can't conceive of something unless you have a word for it. And so building students' word knowledge is so profoundly important, so easy to overlook, you know, routinely done as if it were a skill in this country. So we try to propose a different, and I'm happy to say, like, very joyful model of vocabulary instruction. We have a chapter on the importance of writing, you know, that writing and reading both engage the same code, that if we use writing activities intentionally, we can both build students' capacity to have insights about the text and to remember more things about the text, but also to be able to expand their syntactic control, which is their understanding of the forms of syntax in which meaning is expressed. There's a chapter on, it's a defense of the book. It's just how important it is to read whole books. And I think that there's significant science around this that I haven't seen marshaled in one place. And I just think that's important to make a case for the book. And the last chapter, which Colleen really pushed us to make the last chapter, is this is the culmination of what we're shooting for, is close reading, which is how do we cause students to be able to engage text that is challenging and difficult and beyond their comfort zone and be able to make meaning from it successfully. And so there we talk a lot about taking pieces of text and putting them in attentionally privileged environments and causing them to read short pieces of text at a higher level of insight and perception, and that's where we leave it. So that's a quick summary of the chapters in the book.
Yeah, I actually wanted to come back to chapter 1, Doug, because I'm here to say that I was wrong. I didn't want to start chapter 1 in the way that we did, but it's a research summary, and it's really important because it undergirds the techniques that come in the rest of the book. And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes us, like Doug talked about, this book from Reading Reconsidered, the original book. There was research in there, but this one is just so research rich. And I was like, who wants to read a book that starts off with a research summary? But it's actually lovely. And I think it's really important because this is one of the things that we hope comes out of this book, that we're socializing teachers, we're socializing school leaders, we're socializing policymakers to immerse themselves more in the research. And so we feel lucky that we're able to be the translators of the research, but we also want people to understand the importance of understanding the science behind the decisions that they make in the classroom.
The one thing that I would add in terms of some of the similarities with this book, TLAC Guide to the Science of Reading, with either Reading Reconsidered or our books in general, are how they are supported by the videos. And so it's great that not only is the research and the arguments put forth at the top, but that each of these are then supported by real classrooms in action. And actually, I think it's a testament to the great work being done across the pond that so many of our videos are actually from the UK. It's one thing to talk about the importance of attention, but it's quite another to then see it, how teachers are harvesting attention in their classrooms in a literacy context. And to Doug's earlier point on vocabulary, to see students just lighting up as they are what many would think would be sort of rote instruction around new vocabulary words really made to come alive. So it's both what's different in the new book, but also I think we've never left what we do best, which is really analyze and uplift great practices on video.
I love that you talked in particular about attention there at the start of the book, and the way that that connects to the idea of defending teaching with whole books. Because one of the arguments that I come across commonly in the work that I do, that this really reminded me of, is the idea that pupils have decreasing attention spans. They seem, or apparently, or they seem less and less willing or capable to deal with entire books. And on the assumption, or on that assumption, there's kind of two ways we can go. Some make the argument that, oh, well, we should accommodate ourselves to that fact and thus teach with snippets of extracts. And then there's the reverse, which is say, well, no, actually, this makes a very precise role for schools in intentionally developing that attention span. So I feel like it's lovely to have an ally in the second side of that argument. But anyway, sorry, Kieran, I'll leave it to you.
No, not at all. I think it's a really important point. And I also think, when I think of Teach Like a Champion, I think of the codification and explanation of really complex ideas in ways the teachers can understand. So when I read about the videos and their inclusion in this, I thought that it just makes so much sense. But why should I be surprised that you guys are thinking on this level? Because, it's going to take the words from the page into people's classrooms. And I think that's going to be massive. The primary focus is the reading instruction from, I think, grade 3 up, which, if my maths is right, is year 4 in England, and pupils are roughly 9 or 10 years old, or maybe 8 or 9. What would you say are the key ways that reading instruction should evolve as students move from grade 3 to the final grades of compulsory education?
Yeah, I can start here, and Doug and Colleen can mop up. And Kieran, it's good to hear you also stumble to know how the grades line up. No matter how many times we do it, we always wonder. But essentially, I mean, I think I'm not telling you anything you don't know, especially with Chris on the call. It's a shift from learning to read in the early grades, which of course would be focusing on phonics and fluency, and then shifting to reading to learn in the later grades. But Chris, I'm sure hopefully you like the book for many reasons, but not least of all of which is how your name and your research is found throughout the book. That oftentimes what's neglected, especially in the United States, is the importance of fluency post year 4. That there's this assumption that students already know how to read, and so that we're going to just only focus on reading to learn. And so I think that's, even though that's how we look at them differently, it's important to bring both to both the early grades as well as the later grades. And when we think about knowledge, especially in the upper grades, we think, of course, contexting the book where it is in time and place. But what we often neglect are what we have started to call embellishments or knowledge feeding, which is you might actually have a pretty good handle on where a book takes place, but encounter words, for instance, we're planning our secondary units at the moment. And we're reading this book, Fences. And so I just not noted all of the words that might make students stumble, even if they're well contexted in the history of the book. Words like burlap, sickle, alfalfa, right? None of this takes place on a farm, by the way, but it's just those allusions. And so just being attentive, not only to the larger historical context that a book takes place, but making sure that students have the knowledge fed to them that they need at the right place. I will say we almost called this book, Doug already alluded to the fact that we struggled with the title, but we almost called it Beyond Phonics because we wanted to focus on those upper grades. Again, because so much great research has been done in those early grades, but it's actually the later grades that need just as much attention because, Chris, as you mentioned, so many of us, adults included, are reading a book with their cell phone right by it. And so how do we sort of support that new evolution of where our brains are?
One of the themes, I think, of the book is bringing the text back into the classroom. That whether you're talking about fluency or vocabulary or knowledge building, that the act of reading together is easy to overlook as it's one of the fundamental things we do as reading teachers. And that if we bring great texts into the classroom together, we can intentionally shape students' experience. We can cause them to read for 10 minutes at a stretch from that great text, right? And therefore, thereby rebuild their attention. But also, as we do that, we can recognize, to Erica's point, like, oh, this word probably wasn't clear to my students, and so I could just feed you some knowledge about it right here. And I think maybe one of the most surprising things about the book, maybe for teachers, is how joyful the videos are. that when stories started as shared experiences. We told them around campfires and the myths of prehistory to both to share information, but also to affirm ourselves as groups and to bring ourselves together. And the experience of laughing or gasping at a text together, I think, is one of the last great hopes for the book in the era of the smartphone, which is, it's about the connections we make with the book and with each other as we're reading. And so I think that one of the sort of overall themes is the act of reading together in class. In many cases has been sort of pushed to the margins of the classroom. We have a colleague who we really respect, who for many years is like, the reading should always happen at home, and in class we should be only discussing the text. And I think we respectfully dissent from that, especially now that the act of reading the book together, a shared book together in class, is extremely powerful. And maybe this is implicitly a case for that.
I think a lot of, especially secondary teachers, think that the work, the teaching, the learning is what's happening outside of the reading, right? It's in the writing, it's in the discussion, it's in the analysis. And so one of the things that we're hoping this book helps people to understand is that there's real teaching that's happening within the reading of a text. When we are spending time reading together, we're really building students' capacity for those language comprehension strands of Scarborough's rope that are always important for readers to be developing, even when they're developing their word recognition skills. But as soon as they have those word recognition skills in place and they've mastered phonics and decoding, then we just really, really want to emphasize the building of the language comprehension strands and giving students opportunities to apply that knowledge strategically as they're making meaning of increasingly complex text.
I think one of the great things about this kind of embedding the shared reading of books into the classroom is that you get to take advantage of different aspects of developing pupils' knowledge. So obviously you talk in depth about the explicit teaching of vocabulary, syntax, etc., through things like close reading and phase reading, etc. But there's also this other side of things, this implicit learning of language that we are kind of taking advantage of as well, just through the sheer breadth of reading. I mean, the vast majority of vocabulary that we know as adults has never been explicitly told to us or shared with us. Most of it has been picked up through shared, meaningful language experiences. And so while the book rightly focuses on the value of explicit instruction, it also, through this idea of bringing reading into the classroom, shares this idea that, well, there is also this implicit learning of language that can take place as well, which is partly what makes reading so fascinating, in that there are elements that absolutely require explicit teaching. But as we move through school, there's also this large element of implicit learning about language that we can tap into as well. And I guess this brings me on to the next question, because you started talking about the value of fluency, and I think we talked about that a little bit more there. And in the section, the chapter on fluency, you talk about different ways of teaching reading. Initially, you talk about three kinds of reading. So there's phase reading, accountable independent reading, and teacher read alouds. Now, each of those three, if you ask me to place a bet on how well they develop pupils' fluency, I'd bet that together those three things absolutely do contribute to pupils' fluency, especially once they're quite a way down the road. The challenge we have, of course, is that currently there's scant evidence that any of those three things will contribute to reading fluency, which is why I think it's so fascinating that you kind of talk about and show videos for the way that repeated reading can contribute to that, especially if we're thinking about earlier grades. So just to kind of tie this up into a question, how is it, do you think, that repeated reading, how do you envision repeated reading playing a role in classroom instruction, especially in grade 3 and grade 4? And how might that instruction change as pupils and classes develop their reading capabilities?
Is it okay if we start by talking a little bit about phase reading and the way that I think that it works really nicely with repeated reading, which is some of the favorite videos that we show in the fluency section. I think in one of the questions that we saw in advance, somebody asked about how phase reading is different than round robin reading, or how it might be similar. And this is one of my favorite questions. So I actually want to start off by just talking a little bit about the sort of conception that people often have when we start to mention this idea of shared oral reading, which is round robin reading, which is what most of us probably experienced when we were students. I have vivid memories of my 8th grade social studies teacher. Every day we would go into class and we would sit down and everybody would be assigned a paragraph. And if my paragraph was number 8, guess what I was focused on in paragraphs 1 through 7? Paragraph 8, paragraph 8, paragraph 8. I just wanted to nail it. And as soon as paragraph 8 was done, I was like, okay, I was in 8th grade. And so I was probably like, you know, thinking about the boy I had a crush on in row 2 or whatever it was. And so phase reading, which is our system for shared oral reading, I think it's really critical because we know that the only way that students are going to develop fluency is to hear models of fluent and expressive reading and to get lots of oral reading practice. And so for us at the secondary level, we think that phase reading, the system for shared oral reading, is the best way to do that. And so phase, for anybody that's not familiar, it's an acronym for the type of reading that it's designed to reinforce. So fluent, attentive, social, and expressive. And it's very different than round robin reading because there's a lot of intentionality and pre-planning that goes into a phase reading in class. One piece of this is that it includes lots of what we call teacher bridging, which are just moments of teacher read aloud in the midst of student reading. And so the teacher serves as a bridge between student readers. And that's really critical because as the teacher, I can decide with intentionality, what are the passages that are going to be most important for me to model for my students? Is there, is there a type of complexity of syntax that's going to be hard for my students? And so really the only way to show them how to read that with appropriate prosody is for me to model it. It's a really critical section of text. And so I want to make sure that all students have that. And so there's this intentionality of what am I modeling as the teacher? Then, in contrast to round robin reading, with phase reading, we don't assign or pre-assign the passages. We actually do pre-assign the passages in our teacher copy where we're making notes to ourselves, but students don't know this. And so for students, the identity of each reader who's going to be reading next, it's unpredictable. And this is really to support attention. So we want to have as many kids as possible with their eyes on the page so that they are seeing the words, even if they're not the ones who are orally reading. And it's never intended to be a gotcha. So when we do this really well, it's done with predictability. And if we notice that there are kids who are struggling to follow along while others are reading, then we want to have supports in place to make sure that they're able to do so. And then we're also able to keep the durations of reading unpredictable. And we can vary this. So based on what we know of the text and what we know of the reader, we can make the best decisions. I'm never going to assign my struggling readers the most complex, difficult, long section of text, but I am going to make sure that it's an inclusive experience and they are getting practice just like everybody else. We have this really beautiful video of a teacher that we show in the book, Jessica Bracey. And she has a student who's reading, and she's a struggling reader. And in a very short amount of time, the struggling reader, actually gets to read 2 times with decoding support. She gets a little bit of fluency prompting for Jessica, as do the other students. The durations that the struggling reader gets are a little bit shorter, but she gets multiple at-bats or multiple opportunities to read throughout the reading, because in fact, it is our struggling readers who need the most oral reading practice. So I say all of that about phase because I think it's a really important foundation for when we're asking students to do repeated readings, especially when we're asking them to do partner reading. Doug, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in here and talk a little bit about the Scott Wells video that we open the chapter with, just because, again, I think that phase is so critical for modeling the type of reading that we want students to do when they're doing a partner read after they have listened to us read. It models the type of quality and the type of attentiveness and the type of expressiveness and fluency that we want students to be reading with when they're reading with either on their own or with a partner.
I think that's a really beautiful description. That I think one of the things we do when we read aloud is we give students a mental model of what text sounds like when it's brought to life. Fully meaningful, often beautiful. Like, how many students have an image in their heads of a story read in the way that's beautiful? In addition to Scott's video, I was thinking about the video we have of Gabby Wolf at King Solomon Academy. she's reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with her. They must be, this is like 10th and 11th grade students, but I can actually hear in my head as I'm telling you this, like her reading aloud to them, describing the maid when she observes the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. She says, it seems that she was romantically given, right? You could like, she reads with maybe like 110% of the expression that you might read to yourself. And at 90% of the pace, so students can really like attend to the way that she infuses these words with meaning. And then she asks them to start reading, and they instantly start mirroring her form of expression, and the students are reading aloud just beautifully from the text and infusing it with meaning. And I think, Chris, you make this point in your most recent book about the iterative relationship between comprehension and fluency, that you have to understand to be able to read it in that way, and that one of the ways that you understand the depth that's in text is by hearing a model like that. And this is what we want the inner voice of students to be like when they are reading silently. I think, Tim Shanahan talks about this, that like when you build a model of reading with expression outwardly like this, then it translates into your silent reading. And that's really what we want. We want students, when they're reading on their own to themselves, to have this deeply expressive model where they're thinking deeply about the meaning of the text. And interestingly, I think when we do this, there are fewer questions that you have to ask about the text, because you can hear the answer in the way that students read often. So I think that phase is in many ways a way to link. Here is Gabby modeling beautiful reading for her students. This is what we're shooting for. We want them to internalize that, and we build this sort of shared culture where not only do they get the chance to practice, but they hear their peers and their classmates doing it as well, and they get this sort of social signal, the social norm that like, people around me are also taking joy and pleasure in reading this book and bringing it to life, and therefore I will try to do it too. And if I can cause you to do that, then your internal reading will be changed.
Doug, I think you were intimating at another theme of the book that we didn't really discuss in Reading Reconsidered, which is just the importance of lesson preparation. So that Gabby was able to have that beautiful reading because she had deeply internalized the text and perhaps even practiced her own reading aloud as well, to be able to do that both unabashedly in front of, I forget what year it was, maybe year 11, but also just with so much feeling that she had to have that preparation done in advance. And Chris, you opened your question with just sharing how little data we have around this. And actually it's fingers crossed and with a bit of, we know that it's early, but two of our colleagues, Jamie Berlante and Sarah Engstrom, launched a phase data cohort this year. And actually the results were pretty impactful. So essentially this cohort engaged in remote workshops around phase reading routines. They did that pre-planning that we talked about. They did practice around phase reading. Each teacher reported themselves and their students using phase reading at multiple times throughout the year. And the results were pretty interesting. In their beginning and end of year assessment using what we call the DIBELS, which assesses both oral reading fluency as well as accuracy, that across all groups, their both fluency and accuracy improved regardless of their grade level. So in one school, we found the percentage of fluent fifth graders, so again, this would be year 6, grew by 26%, and accuracy increased an average of 12%. And students who were disfluent at the start of the year, defined as students who were reading less than 110 words correct per minute, increased their oral reading fluency by 43 words correct per minute. And across all 5 schools, the classes with the highest number of struggling readers actually showed the greatest growth in oral reading fluency overall. So it shows that fluency reading it helps definitely our most struggling readers, but all of our readers, because we found another school, year 9, started the year with 80% of students reading fluently and ended the year with 88% of the class reading fluently. And the students in this class improved by an average of 17 words correct per minute. So it just points to the fact that just this oral reading practice is so important on their fluency itself. And I think to my earlier point around what happens post year 4, that neglecting fluency is at the detriment, obviously, to their own fluent reading, but of course, then we know to their comprehension as well.
I won't say push back because it's kind of somewhat aligned with what you're saying here. From the Hasbrook and Tyndall data about American schools, we know that the average pupil at the start of grade 4 reads at roughly slightly less than 90 words correct per minute. There's about 25% of pupils reading at less than 60 words correct per minute. And I am utterly convinced that the sort of hearing, of shared experiences of reading aloud, of hearing a teacher read aloud, are really powerful for moving fluency for those pupils who are kind of right at the edge. So they're already at 90 or 100, 110, taking them to that higher level. Often I think modeling works really well with, and maybe those shared reading experiences work really well with as well. I guess my question would be, for those pupils who are at 30, 40, 50, 60 words correct per minute, so at the start of grade 4, that's a good 25% of the average American classroom, are they getting the sheer amount of scaffolded decoding practice from something like phase reading in order to get to fluency? And if perhaps they're not, do you think that the way that repeated reading is used in some of the videos is a really powerful part of supplementing that phase reading, or do you think it's just kind of like an optional extra?
It's a great question, and it requires us to make some decisions about where students are when they come to us behind. And for some students who are reading at 30 and 40 words per minute, there is probably a core decoding issue that they are not yet solid on letter sound correspondences. And in that case, I'm going to have to supplement whatever I do in the classroom with with systematic synthetic phonics, explicit instruction in that. There also might be some students who are generally familiar, whose letter sound correspondence is pretty good. There are probably a couple places where they have gaps with, blending. They know the rules for blending adjacent consonants, but they're not quite steady at them, or they're so new at it that their fluency is really, really rough. And in that case, I think that they probably would need some additional remediation outside the classroom. But I think this is one of the places where your book, The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading, was so influential to us, that shared repeated reading of sentences 2, 3, 4 times, often with students, like alternating sentences with a partner, with attention to greater expression each time, right? It's not just the rereading, but it's the attentive to fluency. I think rereading, that's so important. I think that's really, that's going to be really necessary for some really weak students. But if I can link that to what happens in the classroom, for example, if I know that we're going to be reading chapter 3 of Number the Stars on Tuesday, and I'm doing a pull-out group with 3 or 4 really weak students, and those repeated reading sentences that they practice are from the chapter that we're going to read on Tuesday in Number the Stars. Now, one, they are more likely to be able to follow the text and stay along with it and understand what's happening in class and be full participants in the class. And maybe even if they've read a couple of those sentences, I could call on them to read aloud in class from a sentence that I know is a few sentences that I know are going to be accessible to them, and they will be very successful, and that will change their perception of their capacity to read in class. One of the hidden pieces of phase that we think is so important is that I can target students very small pieces of text to read aloud, so they can read them at full focus with their full working memory, not depleted, and so they're more likely to be successful at reading aloud, and maybe to feel more successful, because the student who arguably that it's most important to have read aloud in class is the student who's most on the margins of being able to read fluently. So I think there's a real link. I think your point, which is like for some students, just reading aloud in class via phase reading will not be sufficient. I will have to supplement outside the class. But if I can link that supplementing to what happens in class, then I'm more likely to make them successful. And maybe Colleen was pointing out this beautiful video we have of Scott Wells teaching at Goldsmith Primary Academy in Walsall. Did I say Walsall, right? Close there. Outside of Birmingham, great. And he does, because they've done phase reading repeatedly and kids are good at it and they understand what it means and it sounds like to read aloud, they have a mental model of reading aloud. He actually has them do paired reading, partner reading in the class. So he's practiced with your partner. He walks around, he listens carefully, probably targeted to a few kids who especially needs to give feedback to. And so I think there's so yes, there should be fluency practice for really struggling readers outside of class. I can also engineer, if I've made oral reading part of the culture through phase reading, I can do more paired reading in class. And I think that's going to be important for some of my weaker readers.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this ties into kind of what potentially happens in grade 2 as well, because you said there that, there is a fairly substantial group of pupils, especially in year 2 over here, grade 2, I'd imagine from conversations with colleagues in America, where you've basically got kids who have been through the phonics program. They know the common grapheme phoneme correspondences, the basics of how to blend. But the reason they're not fluent is because, they come across a word like cafe and they think it's cafe or cafe or whatever it might be. And they just haven't orthographically mapped a big enough bank of words to start flowing through text. And the big challenge is, yes, they can decode fine, but how are they getting that scaffolded decoding practice to take them from there to that point where they're reading at 60, 70, 80, 90 words correct per minute because they've orthographically mapped those words. And obviously this is a conversation for another time, but it does also speak to the value of encouraging and supporting parents and carers to maybe give us a little bit of a leg up with that without schools ever, relying on that. Anyway, sorry, Kieran, I feel like I've been waffling for ages. Feel free to dive into the next one.
No, not at all. I think it's really important because, the forensic attention you guys are describing that practice with, I think that's really important for listeners and then obviously readers to understand, because if, for instance, you think about the practice that was common, probably still is common in lots of schools, what you're describing is very different from what I imagine my early reading lessons to be. And I think, so I think the time spent on that is really, really important. I was trying to think of a baseball analogy. I was thinking, is it a fastball? But actually, I think you can get big gains with a fastball. So, and it wasn't a curveball. So I don't know what type of pitch we've just given. I think the section on close reading is a tour de force. And I think teachers can go back to year after year and still have stuff that they can use to develop their practice. If you could boil these recommendations down for someone at the very start of their career, what would you say are the key things they need to know?
The first thing about close reading is that we want to make sure that kids are reading a sufficiently complex text that is worthy of close reading. And so you're not actually close reading if you're reading, a level text or a simple text. And so we want to make sure at the outset, when we think about close reading, we're reading a rich, complex text. The second thing is, and we've really, I think, learned this from watching teachers try to do close reading after Reading Reconsidered, is that we're never close reading for the sake of close reading sake or for asking close reading questions. But the reason that we're close reading is because we're trying to make meaning of a text that's complex. And it's always going to be tied to our larger objective of the day. And we think that a good objective is to understand the section of text that we're reading deeply, which of course is tied to our holistic understanding of the reading of the book. And so I think those are just like two key things foundationally starting. What does it mean to close read, and what do I need to consider when I'm thinking about close reading? After that, I think one of the biggest pieces of close reading, because we are reading a complex text, so often teachers want to jump to what we call analyze meaning questions, right? And so they think that the rigor is in the analysis. And so I'm going to start to ask questions about symbolism and layers of meaning. And what actually happens is they've failed to do what we call establish meaning. And so we haven't supported kids or confirmed literal understanding of the text before we want to start to talk about, again, theme and symbolism. And so really at the heart of close reading, it's reading a complex text with a goal of making meaning. And it starts with, what are the areas that are critical, or what are the areas that are challenging? And it's going to be really important for me to confirm that kids are literally understanding what's happening. I can't tell you how many times in my own class when I was teaching, I would be, like having this like deep conversation about a scene and the theme that it reflected, and only to realize that kids didn't actually know which characters we were talking about that were involved. And so we've just really learned the importance of those established meaning questions. Doug, I'm going to pass it to you so you can talk about attentionally privileged environment, because this was one of the things we really learned through looking at the examples of close reading in our own curriculum.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. I'm thinking here about one of my favorite videos in the book, which is a video of a teacher named Jen Brimming, and she's teaching Lord of the Flies at Marine Academy, Plymouth, and it's such a beautiful lesson. First of all, Lord of the Flies is such an important book to read, but it's a really challenging book, both in terms of background knowledge and in terms of the complexity of the syntax. And so during this lesson, she chooses a very small amount of text that they're going to study deeply, and she puts it in what we describe as an intentionally privileged environment. She projects it on the screen, and it's also in students' work packet. And I think that this is such a mundane thing, but it's really, really important, which is when we want students to do their most analytical work, we have to do it in a setting that allows them to maximize the availability of their working memory. And so if I'm asking you to think about a sentence or think about two sentences, and let's just say for a moment, I read you that sentence and then the sentence disappears from view and you have to try to hold in your memory what that sentence said and talk about it at the same time. Most of your working memory is used just remembering what the sentence is. It's not available to you to do the hard work of analysis. Or if I ask you to compare a sentence on one page to another page, and you have to just simply like flip back and forth from page to page, a lot of your recognition of what you observed about the first sentence is lost as you flip pages to find the second sentence. So in Jen's example, she's projected this interesting sentence on the board. Oftentimes there'll be like maybe two sentences from different pages, but they're projected together, and the students can like glance at one, glance at the other, see how it's different, see how a theme is, images, a similar idea is described in similar imagery, and then glance back at the first and refresh their working memory of the first. Or in my favorite example, in addition to using this idea of just like putting language in an attentionally privileged environment, projecting it to students, asking them, putting it in a place where they can constantly refresh their working memory of it as they're thinking about it. She uses what a lot of we think is really fascinating research around the law of comparative judgment, that it's much easier for people to make concrete comparisons between complex ideas than to make abstract or absolute judgments about them. And so there's this beautiful line from Lord of the Flies. It's from the beginning of the book when Ralph is it's describing Ralph when he arrives on the desert island. I'm sure most people know the story of Lord of the Flies, but like it's this group of boys from an elite boarding school who are stranded on the desert island, and they very quickly revert to the most savage elements of human nature. And so there's foreshadowing in this sentence. This is what William Golding wrote. He became conscious of the weight of his clothes, kicked off his shoes fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. And so Jen has rewritten that sentence slightly so that it says he became conscious of the inconvenience instead of the weight of his clothes, kicked off his shoes eagerly instead of fiercely, and removed instead of ripped each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. So she puts the two versions of this sentence on the board so that students can compare what does it mean to say fiercely instead of eagerly, to rip off your clothes versus remove your clothes. And so I think by giving students very small units of analysis where they can harvest the full benefit of their working memory and suddenly do this concrete comparison, oh, the original version is really getting it like the savage, the savage underlayer of human behavior. It's reflected in William Golding's word choices. Then I start to see how meaning is made in this text, and I start to read each sentence differently from there. But I think a lot of it is just using very basic principles of cognitive science around like harvesting working memory when we present complex text and allowing students to make concrete comparisons between different examples. That's surprisingly powerful. And I think when people watch the video of this lesson, they'll just be really inspired by how deeply students are able to read this passage because of the way that Jen presents.
I mean, thinking about the beautiful complexity in which you describe close reading in your book, I wonder, out of curiosity, where you work with these teachers, I mean, in a lot of cases, not all, obviously, but in a lot of cases, are these teachers who are able to specialize in the teaching of English, or are these sometimes, presumably with grades further down, these are teachers that also teach, 10 other subjects. I'm sorry, it's just out of curiosity, because obviously the extent to which a teacher can engage with that complexity of close reading will to some extent depend on how much of their time and attention and professional development they can devote to that aspect of teaching reading compared to, say, teaching maths or PE or history or whatever it might be.
I think the answer to that is both. There are some teachers who have sufficient subject knowledge and passion that they are English teachers and their degree is in English. And there are some who are, they are teaching 8 different subjects in the course of a long day. And I think this is an implicit argument in the book, is just for the power of curriculum, and often, shared. Because you have a shared curriculum, does not mean you can't adapt it as a teacher and make changes to it. But really, the ability to find this perfect sentence to study and to think about the background knowledge in it necessary, or to embed a short nonfiction paragraph that describes, for many readers in English schools and most readers in American schools, what it means to have gone to a boarding school in mid-century England, what the home counties are, right? Like, this requires a lot of preparation and a lot of knowledge, and really teachers should be given a version of rich curriculum where it's someone's job to take the time to study the book deeply, that a way that the teacher who has 8 different subjects that she's teaching can't, and to source the right background knowledge passage, and to choose exactly the right sentence to compare to another sentence and rewrite that sentence carefully. It takes a lot of time. It's a different skill from teaching. We just think that teachers deserve rich curriculum that can support them. And just because someone gives you a curriculum doesn't mean you can't change it or adapt it, and bring your own expertise to it. But there's a real challenge for all teachers, but particularly for teachers of reading, and just the amount of time and effort that are required to prepare lessons to bring books to life. And we just think this is an area where shared curriculum is a must.
Yeah, I have to admit, I buy that argument entirely, even though to some extent, like, the work that I do is often trying to support teachers to deal with a world where these things are either, in English schools at least, non-existent or often unaffordable. I mean, I do think in an ideal world, across groups of schools, in England and beyond, it would be the best way of going about this sort of thing would be to provide the sort of curriculum materials that I know that you provide to schools from grade 5 and up. It's just, for a lot of places, it's kind of the challenge of creating these things. Just as an aside on that kind of idea of teachers of younger pupils, teachers of older pupils, specialists and non-specialists. One of my key takeaways from your book is, I think I wrote down somewhere, the idea of cross-fertilization. There seems to be this sense in which some of the expertise of specialist teachers are being carefully brought down for, teachers perhaps in grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, when you're talking about allegory and imagery, etc. And the reverse, in that this focus on intentional development of reading fluency is then being kind of brought to the specialist English teachers older as well. So yeah, that's more of a statement than a question.
I mean, my question would be, is the publication date global, or will teachers in the US get access to it before the UK? Do you know what the timeline looks like for teachers to get their hands on it?
We believe it's accessible. Doug's pointing at me and Colleen. We believe it's for purchase, available for purchase now across the globe.
No, Kieran, I was just going to say that, yeah, it's to the best of my awareness. I don't think I'm special in having received it. I mean, I love the idea that I've got a copy earlier than anyone else, but I'm not sure that's the case.
No, you are special, Chris. And actually, it's funny, when we were talking about the book and like ways that we wanted it to be different from Reading Reconsidered, we actually mentioned your book because it's been so influential on us in a variety of ways. But one of the things we also just love is like how disciplined you were in its length, right? I feel like you present the ideas in such like concise and clear ways. It makes it really usable. And we were like, yeah, we want to do that. 450 pages later, we didn't actually achieve that, but that was really one of our goals.
And Chris, I think when you were your earlier questions around how do we make sure that these ideas are cross-pollinated across teachers. I think really the ideas that started in this book, Doug, started in your first version of Teach Like a Champion in 1.0 in 2010, where there was a chapter called Everybody is a Reading Teacher. And so it really is, I think that's another thing that speaks to the later grades, which is just the importance that everybody at least have an understanding. And also I think where phase can fit in as well, that fluency doesn't just have to happen in the English class, but what does it look like in history? What does it look like in science, even in math? And so we do offer workshops on all these topics, but one of the things that we're trying to focus on this year is getting schools and teachers who aren't literacy trained to at least have some tools in their pocket where they can support all students.
Fantastic. I mean, and that succinct nature is something Chris has really mastered with the written word, not yet the spoken word, unfortunately, but that's the running joke here for the last 5 years. If there are any links that you guys think would be useful, I'll put them in the show notes, but also in our newsletter on Monday, or the Monday after the episode goes out, and we'll make sure people get access to those. But it has been an absolute pleasure. One for the bucket list for the podcast is to have you guys on to chat. So it's been an absolute pleasure. All that's left to say thank you very much for joining me.
Kieran, thanks for having us on. Chris, great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Good to see you, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you both. Really appreciate it.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.